Welcome to Roots of Representation, a podcast series brought to you by Knology, a leading organization creating practical social science for a better world. The podcast series is a part of our larger National Science Foundation-funded project called Black Rep for Kids, where we delve into the power of storytelling in helping young Black children prepare for and tackle the challenges of climate change. If you're interested in learning about how we can build a brighter climate future for Black children, their families, and their communities, you've come to the right place. Let's get started with Roots of Representation, the podcast centering Black climate story worlds for young minds.
Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of the Roots of Representation podcast. I'm your host, Crystal Allen, and I couldn't be more thrilled to be here today. As a proud member of the leadership and advisory team of NSF-funded Black Rep for Kids project and representing the Highlights Foundation, I am deeply passionate about amplifying diverse voices in children's literature. In addition to being an author of children's books published by Bowser and Bray, I also serve as the co-director of Kindling Words East and a faculty member of Highlights for Children. I am honored to be a committee member of the Brown Bookshelf, an organization dedicated to raising awareness of the incredible Black voices writing for young readers. If you want to learn more about my work, the inspiring initiatives of Black Rep for Kids, and an upcoming unconference in October 2024 in Charlotte, North Carolina, be sure to visit our website. Now, on to today's episode. We are incredibly fortunate to have a very special guest with us. She is not only my esteemed colleague and a dear friend, but also an exceptional author who has made a remarkable impact in the world of children's literature. Christine Taylor-Butler is an incredibly talented children's book author, having written over 80 books, including the highly acclaimed Lost Tribe series. Her commitment to promoting diversity in character representations is truly inspiring, and she leads by example in everything she does. As a graduate of the prestigious Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Christine's background as a scientist, civil engineer, and architect, oh my gosh, adds a unique perspective to her writing. She has also contributed nonfiction works to Scholastic's esteemed True Book educational series. Christine resides in Kansas City with her husband and is a proud mother of 2 adult daughters. Christine Taylor-Butler, it is an absolute pleasure to have you here today. Welcome to the Roots of Representation podcast.
Well, I don't know. What do I say after that? Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I've got a lot to ask you because we are just so excited that you're here, and we're just going to take advantage of it. So
okay.
I'm just going to get started with my first question, okay?
Go ahead.
All right, here we go. We've invited you to share your insights on the storytelling and bookmaking process, and in particular, to learn about ways to center Black characters and voices in stories for young audiences. Beyond that, we'd also like to hear your ideas about ways to tell stories related to climate change, specifically those that can help Black children and their families learn about, prepare for, and deal with all of the environmental threats that disproportionately impact Black communities. But to start things off, could you just tell us a bit about your work as a writer, how you came to it, what inspires your writing, and how it speaks to questions of diversity and STEM literacy?
Oh, okay.
That's a mouthful, I know.
It is.
I'm sorry.
Well, I always wanted to be a writer.
Okay.
But when I was growing up, writing was not considered a real job in my neighborhood. You could be an engineer, you could be a lawyer, you could work for the post office. But I was really intrigued by writing. But I ended up doing engineering. I had a really good 8th grade math teacher who said, there's a school I think would really like you, which is MIT. And in the background, my mom had been negotiating with a boarding school and my guidance counselor
Mhm.
to get me to go to high school in New Hampshire. So from the 10th through the 12th grade, I actually went to high school at Phillips Exeter Academy, where all of a sudden I'm now not in this inner city school. I'm surrounded by these kids who grew up in families where everyone's always talking about college and aspirations. And so it kind of changed my mindset. After I graduated from MIT, I got conned into, that's what I say, I got conned into in the evenings interviewing prospective 12th graders who were interested in attending MIT. And I started to figure out that as the years went on, I started to see fewer and fewer kids who were reading for fun. They were only reading whatever it took to get an A on the test
I
or
see.
an
Yeah.
A. And one day I had a particularly difficult boss. You know, he had switched with a really supportive mentor of mine, and we were not seeing eye to eye. And I said, you know what? I have a project. It's $6 million. It's coming in early and under budget. I quit. My team knows what to do. I quit. And he's, and he's shocked because, and he says, what are you going to do? And I said, I think I'm going to write children's books. And they said, no, we'll fix whatever's going on. We will fix it. And I said, I don't, I talked to the head of Hallmark and I said, I don't want you to fix it because the whole point of going to MIT is what problem are you trying to solve?
Mhm,
It
mhm.
isn't necessarily the career. I said, I have done a lot of work at Hallmark. My husband moved to Kansas City, and so I ended up working at Hallmark. And I said, all the engineers know what to do. Um, but there's kids out there who need better literature. So
Right.
let's see how to make that work. So I did what I would tell other people not to do. I switched to writing full time. So,
And let me tell you, we are so glad you did.
well, thank you.
That was a great career move. So, Christine, during your career as a writer, you've been a strong advocate for character diversity in children's literature. When it comes to creating stories with Black protagonists, what kind of challenges have you faced? And what have your experiences taught you about ways to overcome the white gaze that often tries to force authors of color to tone things down for fear of alienating or offending white audiences?
Okay, so I started, when did I quit home? I quit Hallmark at the end of 1999. So I started my writing career in 2000. And I think my first book didn't get published until 2003. It's a lot harder than people think.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a story about a Black boy who wanted to join a jump rope contest. So no civil rights, no slavery,
Right.
no oppression,
Right.
just a fictional story because I grew up, so I grew up having to translate. There were next to no books featuring kids that look like me. But when you grow up in the 60s and you're Black, you're used to that. That is just the way the world was. But, now I have girls and they were very into books like Harry Potter and I thought, there's something wrong with a system where they're constantly having to translate.
Yes.
So I write this book, and it's a Black boy surrounded by Black girls who are the villains. They don't want to practice with him, they don't want to play with him. And that book went on to sell 100,000 copies.
Wow.
So that's 2003, and you would think Scholastic would go, wait, I think there's some merit here because I think we had uh, maybe 24 books in the series. Maybe it's 12. But it was created by Burnett Ford, who's passed away.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just supposed to be joyful stories about Black kids.
Right. Black joy.
Black joy. And I did 2 books for her, and the books did extremely well. And Scholastic wasn't interested in anything else but me writing science for them. So that's how I got into STEM. Was I met an editor who, by the way, happened to be Black, and she said, "You've got this engineering degree. Why don't you write STEM?" And I said no, and she said, "Why?" And I said, there's a lot of research that goes into it. It has to be correct. And she says, "But there are not a lot of people who could do it your way, who could enjoy it." So so I did a lot of STEM, and I tried to make sure that whenever possible, we included people of color, but there's two issues that we're dealing with. One is there were at the time more books coming out with people of color, but they were almost always written and illustrated by white um, authors and illustrators. And
Mm-hmm.
I went back and I said, we want a seat at the table. And so if they can write about black characters, can I write about white characters? You know,
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to create another ghetto bus where you're black, you can only write black characters. I want to
Right.
write about whatever characters happen to make sense.
Right. Okay. So, what does it mean to hear Black and African American voices and the context of their lives when they are only words?
Okay, so they're subtle. And I've been really quick to explain that I grew up in Cleveland, and then I went to high school in New England and
Mm-hmm.
college. Then when I met my husband, who is also from Ohio but was going to a different college, we moved to Kansas City. I said, my experiences don't match my cousins who grew up in Compton in California.
Right.
So the first thing is to recognize there's more than one voice and there's more than one experience. You know, even as we later talk about climate change in Cleveland is different than climate change in Boston,
Right.
different than climate change in Los Angeles.
Right.
And so we need lots of people sharing their experience. But I have a book out called The Get Together, which is about a family reunion that goes off the rails.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why it got turned down quite a bit, or it got, looked at by publishers who were interested but didn't know what to do with it. And this was long before there was diversity
Mm-hmm.
as a driving force.
Mm-hmm.
And I had a scene in there that said the smell of frying chicken and frying hair wafted from the kitchen. And Raycraft Books was the first publisher that understood I meant they were straightening someone's hair on the stove.
Oh my.
I didn't have to say straightening and there's a straightening comb, but they knew exactly what I was talking about. And I knew that was an editor who would get all the other references in
Yes.
the book.
Yes. That would allow you to unpack.
That would allow you to unpack.
Yes.
So and I've had people from different cultures saying, oh my God, this is my family.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're a Black person, you recognize some of the subtle Black references going on that are unique to a lot of families, regardless of where you grew up.
Wow. There's a lot in that a lot. Okay. So through your work, what have you seen in terms of the ways that children's STEM literature presents Black characters? What kind of messages do you think Black children and their families are taking away from this literature or from other STEM media that tries to engage young audiences?
Okay, it's positive. And again, I'm that person who says it isn't just Black kids who need to see themselves in literature. It's everybody else who needs to see them in the same literature.
Mm-hmm.
Because I pointed out every February we do what I call Black Oppression Month. How many ways can we tell you about the struggle? And I think the struggle is fine. But sometimes when you want a bicycle, it's because you're a kid.
Right.
It's not because
That's
you're a
all.
Black kid.
Right.
So if you look at, for instance, books by Don Tate, Don does a lot of like biographies of people who, for instance, the Super Soaker
Uh-huh.
was invented by a Black engineer.
Yes.
And kids are playing with Super Soakers, and nobody is playing with things and going, gee, I wonder who invented this. And so, Don has done books over the years that take contemporary people and saying, look at what you're doing, as a child that was actually invented by this person.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at Andrea Loney, she has a series about a young girl in space.
Yes.
And she takes the time to make sure that her science is correct, even though it's about a Black girl in space. It's not about a Black girl being Black. It's about a Black girl being a girl who happens to be Black. And I think that's what you need to see. We need to get everybody on the table using their efforts and their assets to solve world problems. And that's not going to happen if it's always a white boy.
Yes.
Who is the hero, or if we need to sub, it's a girl, but it's almost always a white girl. And I had pointed out that if you grow up in an environment where you are always the hero, um, that's why we end up with some of the tragedies that we have right now, which is people of color who are Native American or Mexican or Black. Those are the villains, or those are the people who are the ones to be afraid of.
Right.
And so, because I have a science background, I was like, first off, we need to get more STEM, and we need to get STEM beyond coding. I tell people cooking is chemistry. Dancing is physics, basketball is physics,
Right.
mechanical engineering. And so, if we, instead of talking about STEM as if it's this separate thing, just start to incorporate it in everything so people will understand it,
Right.
It makes it easier for kids to grow up and say, oh, this is what I'm doing.
So it's not necessarily changing the mindset of children, it's changing the mindset of the adults who are bringing the information to the children so that they can see that Black is a great color. It doesn't
Yes.
always have to be affiliated with something bad. Black clouds and, villains wear black. And anytime there's something dark, it's wrong or it's
Right. There is no reason why, especially since a lot of this will have to do with illustration, for instance, why the kids can't be multicultural.
Yes.
In the book.
Absolutely.
So those are the things I kind of push for. And then every now and then I get a disconnect because I wrote a book about animals planning a party in the barn for the little girl, for Sterling, which is part of Barnes and Noble. And when the illustrations came back, I was a white girl. And then I realized, wait a minute, I'm a Black author, but the illustrator was someone who used to work at Hallmark. A lot of us used to work at Hallmark, who had since moved to Europe. And that was what was in her head. And you know what? It was okay. The book sold a lot of copies. It was okay. But in general, I always try to say, I want to make sure that all kids are reading books in which all kids are represented.
Yes.
So they begin to see the world versus the world from their perspective.
I think it's sad to me that white is the default.
Yeah.
If it's not shown in the story somehow, it's just automatically believed that the child is white.
Because most of the gatekeepers are white.
Yes.
And that's the other thing we need to work on. We need more Black librarians, more Black teachers, more Black book buyers, more Black bookstores, or minority bookstores. We just need an awareness that if you don't have materials near you that look like the world, then something's wrong with the way you're acquiring those materials.
Right. So, in your work and life, what have been some of the most common challenges you've seen Black children and families confront when it comes to climate change?
Okay, so there's the immediate. The immediate is if you're Black, you're more likely than not, because of racism and gentrification and redlining, to live in a neighborhood that is closer to places that are environmentally unhealthy. You're closer. You may be living closer to a landfill, or you may be living closer to manufacturers that are outputting gases in the air. Cars. Okay, we don't think about cars, but cars are burning gas, and that's creating something. And yes, you have things in your car that are trying to clean part of that before it comes out in the air. But you're more likely to be exposed to carbon dioxide, which then goes in the air and affects the environment that you live on. And we have started to notice, and I think the current political environment started to notice, that you want to put in a highway, you don't put it in through a rich white neighborhood. You put it through the middle of a poor Black neighborhood. And you essentially, if you're a kid, you could walk and see your friend a couple blocks away. Now you walk and there's a highway between you and the house that your friend lives in, if that house even still exists. So that's the thing that's immediate, but there are longer term issues. We're on a planet that is going to change whether there are humans living on it or not. So there's climate change that is normal for this kind of environment. And the example I would give is the sun has like a north and south pole, and it changes every 11 years. So we have a north and south pole. It is not changing every 11 years, but it is slightly changing, and there are scientists that kind of track where it is. But we have been killing off whales, for instance, for years. The whales have been used for their blubber and for their bone structure. We would make, umbrellas, out of them. And whales were consuming the carbon dioxide output of maybe, 400,000 cars. So those are the things people don't think about, which is I just finished writing 3 books on endangered animals, and they are dying because of what climate change is doing to the world. Polar bears,
wow,
need sea ice, and whales, because we have faster boats that can keep up with them, are dying. And then we have plastics that we are putting in the ocean. So I ask kids to think about 2 different things. What can you do to think about how climate change is affecting your family right now in terms of things that you can do in your immediate neighborhood, like recycling, and trash, and pushing to not have more corporations open near your neighborhood, and insisting things get clean. You can see, if you're driving through a city, this is a neighborhood the city cares about because it's perfect. And then you cross the street, and all of a sudden it's like there's a barrier, but all of a sudden there's the trash.
There's a railroad track.
And people are dumping things in lots. So that's the first one. The second is, what can you do globally? Because if we are not protecting, for instance, endangered animals, and all the things we are doing as humans to endanger those animals, we are then not protecting ourselves, because it's like a canary in a coal mine. First goes the animals, then goes us.
Yeah, that whale example that you just gave won't leave my head. And I'm wondering how many people knew that or know that information, and which just kind of encircles what we're talking about here, the importance of children's books that the whole family can read and get an understanding about how climate change really affects us. And that was a huge piece of information for me, Christine. Thank you for bringing that to the table.
Oh, you're welcome.
So, given how complex climate change is, how can we create books and other kinds of media that help young Black kids wrap their heads around this topic in a way that doesn't scare them, but that gives them hope? Like a sense of agency and a knowledge of how to effectively prepare for and respond to a multitude of environmental threats.
Well, first, think like a kid. And we underestimate how much kids can absorb.
Right.
I think we were talking at breakfast at my table this morning about someone who wanted to write a book, and an editor says, I think that would scare a kid.
Yes.
And I said, I raised 2 kids, and I had not realized with the internet how much more they're exposed to than what I thought I was allowing in the house.
Right.
So the first thing is we have to stop treating kids as if they're stupid. They don't suddenly get smart at 12th grade when it's time to go to MIT. The second is, then you put complex language into a book in a way that a kid can understand it. So for instance, with tigers, I would say, once upon a time, there used to be more than 100,000 tigers living in the wild. So not in zoos, 100,000. And now maybe there's 4,000.
Oh my.
But what we would say is that's enough to fill the Coliseum twice. Or if I'm talking about a blue whale and I'm saying this is how much food a blue whale is eating, that for you is the equivalent of 10,000 cheeseburgers. You can find analogies to say, this is the information I'm trying to give this child, but what do they already know? So we can combine those 2, and then it becomes more interesting.
Yes. And it'll stay with them longer.
Yeah.
And, as you're talking about this, it'll also help them come to the table and have something to talk about.
Yeah.
And with possible solutions. So how can we productively incorporate STEM learning into this content?
Okay, so think about this. I tell my kids, let's go bake a cake.
Mm-hmm.
What I have not told them, which I should have told them because I'm an engineer, is when you put those ingredients in a bowl, you're making a compound, right? And then you mix them together, you can't unmix them. Then you
Mm-hmm.
put them in a stove and you apply heat. So now you've got a chemical reaction going on.
Right.
And in 30 minutes, you have a cake. You cannot unbake that cake. That's chemistry, that's science. So, we keep treating STEM as if it's this separate thing, and it's not. It's you have just done this thing, and here's the byproduct of what you have just done.
It's all connected.
It's all connected.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to treat, and I actually got to thinking this way because my daughter had, she had the same teacher for both fifth and sixth grade at her school, and he was teaching China. And so he turned the classroom into China, and he would say, okay, this week you're going to be learning about Chinese language.
Mm-hmm.
And the next week, and I want you to do these cards, and I want you to come back and be able to tell me, how do you draw these characters and what do the characters mean? And then, okay, now this week, you're going to create foods.
Mm-hmm.
And so everything was doing hands-on things related to China. So then he says, okay, now we're going to be the space station. And we're going to set up stations around the classroom. So for the next month, you all are astronauts, and we are going to do science that way. And we are going to do so. If we could find ways to say, this is not a separate subject, what we're going to do is take things you're doing anyway, or take things that you're really interested about. And we're going to say, and oh, by the way, you are playing basketball. This is the physics behind this. This is why you're able to get the ball to rotate this way. This is the velocity. We need to just start taking the science terms and including them in the explanations, what the kids are doing already or what we are having to teach already. So climate change is the same way. You're using a stove, it's creating carbon dioxide.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why people are talking about maybe going to electrical. Do you have to do it that way? Could you do it in the toaster oven instead? Or yes, you're going to use the stove, but don't keep it on longer than you need. If you're using water, think about all the places that don't have access to clean water. So when you're done with the water, turn it off.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's for a minute, then turn it back on rather than letting it run. Or you need it to be hot. So fill up a pitcher with the cold water that's coming out, because then you can use that to water plants. We just make it part of the routine
of our conscience.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what role do you think climate scientists and other researchers who study the impacts of climate change should play when it comes to educating Black children about climate change?
Okay, so you have climate scientists who are looking at the world in general.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really helpful when you have someone like me who's already writing for kids
Mm-hmm.
to be able to call and say, okay, here is the problem. How do we explain that? But I also think the biggest problem that we have, and I saw this when I was going to MIT, is as scientists, we are preparing information for adults. And I've had to go back and say, assume that the majority of the adults that might have access to this material at some point in the future reads at the third grade level.
Mm-hmm.
Because the reality is literacy among adults is low. So yes, you can explain your PhD research to someone else who has a PhD, but if I'm a civil engineer and I'm not working on climate change, I may or may not understand everything that you're thinking. A good example was, and I won't say which publisher, um, I, I wrote something about the problem that we're having with the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And an edit came back and says, we don't need as much as we have, but we do need a little bit to keep the earth warm. And I wrote back and said, no. That is incorrect.
That's not right.
We don't need any of that.
Right.
And then I started sending links. And then I realized that, you can't get mad because people know what they have learned.
Mm-hmm.
Or, you learn a little bit and then you make an assumptions. And these were not people who were trying to be incorrect on purpose. But I said that this is the problem that we have is um, we can have a higher level report, and then we need to be able to. I don't even want to use the word dumb it down because it's not making it dumber.
Right.
It is saying, can you now simplify this so that someone who does not have an advanced degree can also read it and say, you know what, when I'm home or if I'm at work, these are the changes I'm going to make, even small changes, so that I'm having an impact. You know, do I need to drive to the store 4 blocks away? Or in Kansas City right now, the buses are free. They've been free since COVID. Or can I just take the bus and go to the drugstore and get that thing and take the bus back? And then all of a sudden I have not turned on the car. And you're also, you know, the buses are free right now, saving money.
So that kind of brings me to a follow-up question on what you just said.
Okay.
So if someone, let's say with a background in environmental sciences, is thinking about writing a book about climate change for Black youth,
Uh-huh.
what's important for them to know about how to write compelling stories that foreground Black characters and voices?
Okay, so less is more. So
yes, less is more.
If you know a lot, you don't have to. You can leave some space. You know, like picture books are like, you know, 500 words,
Right.
800 words. It might be. So there's first off, there's more than one format. So I always tell people if you're writing, first think about what it is you're writing. And once you think you've got an outline down or you've got a draft down, then go to the bookstore and see what is about that shape. Because it could be a novel, it could be a chapter book, it could be a picture book. Picture books are really popular because you can get through them pretty fast. You can introduce concepts that then lead people to say, I want to learn more, I'll go out and get another book. But in terms of Black faces, there's two things. One is if I am living in a wealthy suburb, my issues are going to be completely different than if I'm living in the inner city. I live in the inner city on purpose, but I live in a big house. 2 blocks away, there are much smaller houses. We are still dealing with traffic. We are still dealing with inner city pollution, even light pollution. I can't look at the stars unless I go outside of the city because of all the traffic lights. So pick something, one thing, and say, how do I explain this to a third grader or a sixth grader? If you're working on a high school book, you can be a lot more, you can have a lot more words. But start with what's the problem.
Yes.
And then figure out how does the problem affect different communities, and then write that way. But I'm going to make a special request. Not all Black people live in ghettos.
Correct.
And it is really important for me, who grew up in the inner city my entire life. I did not live in a ghetto.
I lived on a farm.
Yeah.
You know, I didn't live in the ghetto either.
I lived in a lower middle class neighborhood when I was growing up. We lived with my grandparents, and then, you know, we moved to a neighborhood where the houses were small. But it's important when you're thinking about Black voices that you see a broader representation of what that looks like. So I live in the inner city, but I live in a Georgian colonial house because I like that style. I do know that we were recently watching American Fiction, which is now one of my favorite movies. And I have a joke, my pathology, which is
my path.
Yes. The biggest,
so funny though.
The biggest problem that we have is not the writing. It is trying to get through lots and lots of gatekeepers who are trying to figure out where can we make the most money. And then those gatekeepers are saying, oh, diversity, we want Black characters, but we are going to find in some cases the Blackest, most stereotypical environments to portray.
Right.
So remember, I wrote No Boys Allowed, which is it's out of print now. First class, it was sold 100,000 copies. The illustrator lives in California. I'm from Missouri. The illustrator then showed a California street, but it was still a nice, it was still a nice neighborhood. That book went on to sell 100,000 copies, but I have literally had editors say, we want to do a brownstone in Brooklyn. I'm not writing that. There's a lot of books about that. I think it's important to see those too. But I grew up not knowing I could go to MIT.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in Rogers, Arkansas, and I saw 25 different classrooms. And I'm talking about MIT, and I'm talking about climate change, and I'm talking about climbing Everest and what that climate is doing and how climate change is changing that. And at the end of the week, a teacher came to the adult session and said she had a brown young lady who was fourth grade who wanted to know how I got to go to a school like MIT and was that okay? I mean, what century are we living in?
Oh,
and then
my.
she finally said, but she wanted to go and it was okay. And the teacher says, well, I think you have to work really hard. And she says, what I'm asking is, does a kid like me get a chance to go like that?
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about, I am walking into fifth grade classes, even close to my house, where kids don't know NASA is a real thing or that it is okay to be a black astronaut. We have a black astronaut, Jeanette Epps, who is up on the space station as you and I are talking.
Right.
We need to open up possibilities for kids. If we want kids solving these earth problems, the first thing we need to do is show them a much wider lens than what gatekeepers have allowed. So if you want to talk about climate change, yeah, talk about tigers in India and make sure they understand tigers don't live any place in the wild other than India, because they don't know that. Talk about whales and how much fewer whales we have, because for a very long time there was a huge industry that sent boats out to kill them, and nobody was thinking about how much those whales were doing to stabilize the climate. Let's talk about cutting down rainforests, which are like an air conditioner for the earth.
Mm-hmm.
So we cut down the rainforest, but we are also then eliminating a lot of animals that live in those rainforests. We're eliminating a lot of trees. We're eliminating a lot of plants that don't grow anyplace else that we can use for medicines. Take a thing, but then make sure when we are talking about kids and communities, we are looking at Black and Brown communities. We are looking at Indigenous communities, all of whom are doing the least to create the problem, but are suffering the most.
Right. I'm. Are the things that you just talked about, Christine? Are those the things you'd most like to talk about with other individuals working to increase and improve Black representation in children's climate media?
Yeah, the first thing I would say is especially if we're talking about younger children
Mm-hmm.
through upper elementary, there's a lot of illustrations. You make sure that those illustrations include kids of color. You
Yes.
make sure that in many cases the lead character is a person of color. Just because there's not enough right now, especially in STEM and science. Please make sure kids understand that STEM is actually STEAM, and that coding is not the only thing we want these kids learning. It may be that they're learning it just like math, but I just read something today where MIT has come out and said if you want your kids to be better at coding, teach them music, because music is a code. And both of my kids had to take music lessons because you're reading two lines of music and you're making your hands do two separate things at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Because I needed them to understand you have a much bigger place in the world than the world is willing to give you. And now with that place, what is your contribution?
Uh-huh.
Do you see what I mean? Because
yes, I do.
We're not training people to be climate scientists. We're training people to say, wait a minute, this is how the climate impacts my ability to live on Earth, even if I'm a dancer.
Mm-hmm.
If you're dancing, but there's pollution, is that shortening your life? Have you had someone die because of the pollution, or had someone die because they were exposed to something in the food?
And how does that affect you as a dancer?
Yeah.
That's how we have to get people to think in whatever it is that they're doing. How does that affect you in what you're doing? And maybe that'll bring more people to the table.
Yeah. One of the things we noticed during COVID is how clean the air was in Los Angeles. I have a kid who lives in Los Angeles. I live in Missouri. So we have all kinds of issues in Missouri. But we went to visit her as COVID was winding down. We were like, wow, the air is so much cleaner because everyone was at home,
Right.
was driving. And then I realized when the back to work orders came in and they said, we're paying for all these billets, you people need to come back to work. People were complaining because, gas was up to $6 a gallon, but we couldn't get past the fact that you can see stuff.
Right.
Now
Right.
you can see farther out. And so, you and I are sitting here in Seattle and we're surrounded by trees and lushness.
Mhm.
And it's really hard to kind of go back to the city after
Right.
this.
Yes.
But it's everything. It is how clean is your food? Are you recycling? And then I'm discovering that, the majority of things that are recycled might not be getting recycled because the market is down. Well, for a very long time, recycling was being sold to China, which was burning it. So you look at the environment in China, and the pollution is horrendous. So what we want is for kids to grow up a little smarter than the adults,
Mhm.
and say, when as you're growing up and as you're starting your own families, can we create a world that is going to be easier for future generations
And
to live
cleaner.
in?
Yes.
Yeah, cleaner.
Wow. Okay. Yes. So before I let you go, listen to me. We want to ask you about any other individuals, groups, or resources you know about that we should be aware of. If there are people or organizations contributing to environmental and climate solutions that connect with this work. Do you know of any?
Oh, okay. So there's a ton, and we probably can't get through all of them.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll give an example. Um, when I was researching polar bears, one of the things that I discovered is so there were 19 populations of polar bears that we knew about. And I turned in the manuscript, and there was a 20th population that NASA had been studying for 7 years without telling anybody. And I literally had to call Random House and say, stop the presses. We have to rewrite some of this because here are these polar bears that are not living on sea ice the way the other 19 are. And they might give us some ways of saving all the other polar bears as we try to combat global warming. So NASA, because NASA studies planets, guess what? Earth is a planet. So if you want to look at things on climate change and global warming or just how the planet works, NASA is one of the first places you can look at. If you're looking at something very specific like polar bears, I would highly recommend Polar Bears International, because they will have Zoom meetings with that classes can join. But NASA has an entire department that is just full of educators who will work with schools for free because it's NASA, and we own that. The United States owns that. So I think in Missouri, I go to Huntsville, Alabama, because we don't have a NASA group right in Missouri. But if you're in California, there's several that are nearby. There's Tigers International. There are some groups like Greenpeace. And so there is not necessarily one organization that covers everything. So, and you're not going to be able to cover everything, but pick something that's really interesting to you and say, um, and do a search, because I think you'd be surprised how many nonprofits are out there trying to track what's going on with animals, what's going on with the planet, what's going on with food safety. And if you want to do a little bit more digging, we do have government agencies that are also tracking those same things. Um, So that's what I'm going to say is I'm not going to tell you where to look. I want you to do a little homework. In about 5 minutes, you're going to have more places that than you can cope with. But several of them have parts of their group that are specifically addressing here's how you, as a student or a kid, can get involved with this particular thing that you're interested in.
Awesome. Wow. Christine Taylor-Butler. Oh my goodness. Thank you, thank you, thank you for being a part of the Roots of Representation podcast. You've provided us with some essential information and perspectives to think about as we build STEM-related knowledge into children's climate change literature and hands-on experience. Christine, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
For taking the time to just speak with us today. And we're going to look forward to continuing the conversations with you as our project continues. But for now, I just want to thank you. And from Christine and I, we thank you for listening.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Thanks for listening to Roots of Representation. If you'd like to comment on this episode, please head over to blackrepforkids.knology.org. Our website also contains free resources and more information about the project, which is led by Knology in collaboration with the Highlights Foundation, the National Black Child Development Institute, the Association of Children's Museums, and a panel of nationally recognized advisors. Remember, Black Rep for Kids isn't just a podcast. It's an essential part of the project's culminating experience, which will be a 2-day unconference event held in fall 2024. Head over to the website to register now. And in the meantime, let's keep the conversation going. You can also share your ideas and resources for amplifying Black voices and stories in children's STEM literature at blackrepforkids.knology.org. Roots of Representation is produced by ABF Creative, an award-winning podcast network that creates cultural and emotional connections through podcasts. The series is funded by the National Science Foundation's Advancing Informal STEM Learning Program under grant number 2314101. Any opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this podcast series are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Science Foundation. Roots of Representation, the podcast centering Black climate story worlds for young minds.